Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe, and welcome to the final episode for the month of February. And joining me today is a returning guest making their official debut in the Historians Lounge series. Now, my guest is a graduate of Macquarie University, Sydney, majoring in ancient history. And since as early as he can remember, my guest has been fascinated by history. He's also really good at talking people's ears off. So in 2020, he created a show, a little history podcast. But where to begin with a bloke who's fascinated by all history and loves telling stories? By exploring the stories that we have been telling each other for thousands of years. A Little History podcast delivers a comedic, chaotic, and thought provoking discussion of the myths and folklore of various cultures from around the world. My guest aims to bring a well researched story which he presents to a guest who often has no idea of the subject matter. And though each story is scripted by my guest, every episode is organic, often taking the listener on many hilarious tangents with a lot of laughter and cheeky pokes at the story along the way. And most importantly, my guest strives to present a show that is engaging, informing, entertaining, and doesn't take itself too seriously. His second season is about to wrap up, where my guest will steer the show away from mythology and folklore and cover specific periods in human history. Season 3 will cover the successor period following the death of Alexander the Great. And my guest produces the show from his home on the Sunshine Coast of Queensland, Australia, where he lives with his wife and two daughters. And in this episode, I am excited because me and my guests will be talking about something of the classical age, specifically Alexander the Great and his successors. More specifically, coin production and innovation, and how successors use that to justify their legitimacy. So, without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to a returning guest, podcaster, history lover, content creator, and all around amazing good guy, Patrick Little. Patrick, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having us on, Gabriel. Great to be here, mate. Thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'm humbled.
No problem, man. No problem. Anytime, anytime. So before we dive into today's episode, would you like to share with our viewers and listeners what you've been up to since last time you were on the show?
Well, since last time I was on the show doing the interview, we've been working on wrapping the second season of the show itself. So I've recently released on at time of this recording would have been on Tuesday, the first part of a three-part story on the Epic of Mwindo. So it's an African epic. So it's the first African epic we've done. And super excited to get that one out and start the ball rolling to get towards the end of the season. And as you said in the intro, I'll be steering away in season 3 from mythology and folklore and looking at more of a historical periods or more of a historical narrative, which is a little bit more my bread and butter. So I'm very excited to get that way, and it sort of ties in with today's chat because as you said, it will be on the successor period and just the wackiness that was that time. And so really excited for that one. I've started to get into some freelance writing as well. You were very awesome in getting me in touch with Courtney Atkins of Snowy Point Publishing to uh, basically write an article for him for his in command online journal, military history journal, which is awesome, huge opportunity. So that was really fun to write, and more stuff coming the way from him as well. So yeah, really excited and really pumping. A lot of stuff going on at the moment. So yeah, really chuffed.
Awesome, man. That is awesome. So, since our talk today is about the successor period, specifically coinage and how that was used to legitimize their rule, do you have any actual coins with you to share with our viewers and listeners for them to get an idea of what to expect?
Well, I'm glad you asked because this is the basically when you reached out to me, it was around Christmas time, that or the school holiday or like the Christmas holiday period that you asked me to if I was interested in coming on, and I was like, and I just recently was gifted my very first ancient coin. And yes, I'm 40. I've a little bit late to the party. Two kids, very poor, but finally got to it now. And you pretty much asked me. Whoop, I'm hitting the boom mic. Pretty much asked me the day that I got this one here, and that is a silver drachm, and that is from a lifetime issue from Alexander the Great himself. So it was minted, I think, between 325 and 323 BC, so or BCE. So real close to his demise, and super relevant to the changing period of coin production, and also just the roll on of the Hellenistic influence in the Near East. So yeah, so you pretty much when you asked me, I was like, well, there's one thing I've got to talk about, and it's it stems from that little coin there.
Awesome, awesome. And I think, when we talk about, coinage during the classical period, a lot of people take into consideration the amount of work that goes into coin production, but also what it means to have your insignia on it. Because in the classical age, we look at the Roman period with like the emperors, that was a lot of work. That was specific molds that had to match the emperors of the time. I would imagine it's also the same thing for the successor kings and successor empires of Alexander the Great, which there are so many avenues to explore. But coinage, I don't think a lot of people really touch into. So, Patrick, when diving into the research about, coin production and the creation of these specific coins for the Ptolemies, Seleucids, Antiochs, what did you sort of uncover in your own research?
Well, I tended to find that a lot of the changes, especially immediately following Alexander's death. We're talking the first 7 to 10 years. So immediate. It sounds immediate for us, but for them it would have been a long time because there's a lot going on. But a lot of those changes were really subtle and really small. Where if you're a person receiving these coins in the marketplace, you're a soldier receiving your pay, you often wouldn't even really look at it. I mean, it makes me think about whenever we get physical cash. I know it's a bit alien these days having physical cash on you, but how much we don't pay attention in some ways to the coinage and money systems that we have, the insignia on it. But I suppose because we're maybe distracted a lot more by a lot more TV and media outlets and all that, that we're not really paying too much attention to that. But I suppose if you're receiving these sorts of coins and they're getting around, you would notice the subtle changes in coin production. And it's something that they stemmed on from Alexander and his father Philip II. They started changing the way that they were minting coins. That was very different from the way coins were produced in the Greek world. And Philip was a lot more closer to the Greek world than Alexander in terms of his coin production. When Alexander comes on, I've got some examples that I can show on other contemporary coins from the period where Alexander's production of coins starts to get into a bit more of a Near Eastern feel as well, whilst also keeping really strong Greek and or Hellenic ties and themes, which you wouldn't really think would be a massive change. But when you look at it, you're like, oh, you can. It really ties in my mind, really well with Alexander's, I guess, his aims, probably not initial aims, but his eventual aims of trying to create a hybrid Hellenic and Persian society. So he's finding ways to blend the cultures. I mean, if you look at the mass weddings at Susa, his elevation of Persians in the royal army, and certain satrapies getting elevated in that sort of way. It sort of links in with his. If you look at it that way, the coins link in perfectly with it because it's a way that, like you said, you can legitimize your rule and project that throughout your empire. Because these coins themselves are being, well, a lot of these, the ones that Alexander did in his lifetime, they were called Alexanders. By historians, and that as a way to identify them quite easily. And these coins were primarily produced to pay the army, that
Mm-hmm.
big the big juggernaut that was rolling around. The the now conquered or mostly conquered Persian Empire. So these coins are getting around, they're getting everywhere, and I've seen some quite convincing arguments in some ways that his introduction of these coins helped to regulate the money systems in these new territories. So basically, you're going to see these coins everywhere in the ancient world, or in that part of the ancient world, and you're going to see how these coins are minted and what they represent. So yeah, it was really interesting for such a small little thing like this one here, and that's not even the best example of the actual coins going around, but it's so small and it can still convey such a large amount of information for what you're trying to push. I found that really fascinating.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned before, how coins are produced and how they've changed over time. I'm making comparison to the Roman period. When you look at the Romans, I mean, they had their specific style of minting and coinage. But as the empire went on, the minerals and the metals to make like the very expensive coins, they didn't have those metals anymore. They pretty much used tin as, the mint for these coins. And you could tell the quality had greatly, reduced. And I would imagine, for the successor generals to legitimize their empire, they needed to have those mint stations to craft these coins. And I would imagine to find blacksmiths to not only make the general's face the same likeness to get that regality, it's a process. And again, that also comes back to the wars of the successor kings, where they were all trying to fight for dominion of the empire. But ultimately, what do you have? You have several different kingdoms. You have the Antiochs, you have the Seleucids, you have the Ptolemies, who have their own specific coin imprint. And it just boggles me how, again, we don't really take into account, the history behind these coins, because they can tell a story from these coins. So, Patrick, I know you did send me images of other coins from around the same period, and I'm wondering, were there any slight differences that you noticed from the pictures you sent me to the coins that you have with you currently? Was there any slight deviation? And from those deviations, do you think that may be a result of, the history at the time, or maybe how they were made?
Oh, 100%. It's only the one physical coin I've got, unfortunately. So I wish I had more. I really do. I actually got onto as a bit of it was torture, to be honest. I got on the forum of ancient coins, where there's basically like a big ancient coin market, and it was torturous because you see all these Roman coins, you see all these Greco-Roman, these Greek and Hellenic coins, and you see all these Near Eastern coins and Chinese, and I was like, I want to buy everything. But so from that, I can show. So I'm sorry for the viewers and the listeners. I am a dinosaur, and Skype won't let me share my screen, so I've got to show you on the phone. I'll start with the close up. Oh, hello. You shouldn't be zooming in the way you should be. So this is a close up of the face. I hope it comes up all right. Of the drachm that I've got. So that's 14.27 grams, I think, of silver. So it's pretty. It's for such a small item. It's very weighty. So you can tell it hasn't been diluted. It's from a period where there's so much wealth going on and just flowing through the empire. And I'll show on the back. So in terms of changes, so this one here, that is typically the Alexander. That is not Alexander himself. That's Alexander with an image of Heracles, who he would claim divine right. Oh, geez, that
Right.
from the camera. Yeah. So he and Heracles would always be shown with a lion's head pelt on his head, and that's historically, famously, romantically, what Alexander would wear into battle. He'd always have the lion skin pelt on his head because he would believe, as an Argier, that he was a direct descendant from Heracles on his father's side, so therefore being a further son of Zeus. Which is what Philip would do. If I have that one on, of course I don't. Why would I do that? Why would I have that? Maybe I've seen it somewhere. Maybe on that forum for couple of grand, and I was like, oh god, I want to buy that one. But Philip would display a bearded Zeus on his one in the very similar side face profile that we all look at Western coins today. And so Philip would be saying, "Hey, I'm representing Zeus as my dude with the laurel wreath. Alexander's got Heracles on his one, and it's got the lion heads pelt. You know that. And my one's got where it's been minted, where it's Miletus. A lot of them were at Miletus. A couple. I think it's Sardis as well, and then sort of further east, I think some Babylonian ones were done as well. But what we mean in terms of the insignia is something very interesting. So if we look at, we'll go away from the, oh no, we'll stay on the face actually. What you would end up seeing, so post Alexander's death, the all the diadochi, so the successors, they would be minting coins very close in imagery to the one that I have here, where they will just say, yep, we're continuing Alexander's traditions. All is well with the empire, even though it wasn't. And you know, it's business as usual. Where the empire itself is still kind of together, but everyone's kind of jostling for position. Unfortunately, the succession period of the succession was really uncomfortable because you've got Alexander's half brother Philip Aridaeus, who by many accounts was physically impaired or mentally impaired, sorry, to rule. A lot of people believe he was mentally challenged, and you know, have fun running an empire like that. It's no good. So he was at the beginning taken over by one of Alexander's bodyguards called Perdiccas, and he'd be running it like that. And so, but they'd still be minting coins, and the satrapies, which were all Alexander's generals, a lot of his bodyguards and companions, who would take over and mint coins in the Alexander tradition. But as time progressed, as tensions flared, Perdiccas would get himself killed when he went over to attack Ptolemy in Egypt, because Ptolemy nicked Alexander's body before it was going to go back to Macedon. That's its own little story there. But the story of that tells in Ptolemy's coinage as well, because if you further down the line, you start to see representations, especially not that long after Alexander's death, where they replaced the lion's head for a elephant skin pelt on Alexander's head. So you've still got the typical Alexander, you know, golden brown curls, the thing he's famous for, coming from the bottom of that, but you've got an elephant skin pelt on his head, and they've replaced that as a way to signify or refer back to the Battle of the Hydaspes River against King Porus in India, well, now one day sort of India and that. And I think personally, they've referred to that because you know the Gaugamela and Issus, the battles fought which against the Persian king Darius III, were huge battles and you know, massive changes and all that. But Hydaspes itself was such an achievement for the Greek world. He's gone into basically another planet, going to India. That's as far east as anyone from the Hellenic world really has gone, especially in armed force. And to go there to combat animals in the jungle, to combat bloody elephants in the jungle, and victorious, horrible conditions to fight in, and huge achievement to get away with the W there. So, so a lot of a huge victory, and it's super contemporary. Like it's more what's what I'm trying to say, more recent than the battles over Darius and that. So it's a huge, fantastic victory, and so they start representing Alexander with the elephant skin on top of that. And as it continues, especially in Ptolemy's case in Egypt, because he technically did a naughty thing when he stole Alexander's body, because it was meant to go back to Pella, because that's the ancestral place where all the Argeads, which are Alexander's household, where they're all meant to go and get buried.
Right.
But he supposedly said when he was in Egypt, he went to the oracle at Amun in the middle of Oracle of Amun in the middle of the desert, pretty much. So it's a really remote place there. The name escapes me. And he said, "Oh, I really want to be buried here because, you know, it'd be pretty rad to be a god like the Egyptians are kind of hailing me as." And so Ptolemy takes this probably literally, and he steals the body, takes it back to Egypt, The rest of the successors aren't too happy about that. And there's a bit of a battle for Perdiccas dies, which I said, and everyone's like, all right, Ptolemy, you just chill in Egypt because it's really defensible. And with where I'm getting to with this is that basically because Ptolemy's got possession of the royal body in Argead and Macedonian traditions, the future king buries the previous king. So, but he's got the win in that area, but he can't go out and formally say, "Hey, I'm the new king of the Macedonian Empire," because he's got a handful of really powerful generals with really powerful armies that are just gonna. It doesn't matter how defensible Egypt is. You got enough of those boys going around. They're gonna steamroll him, and so he basically just confers himself as a satrap, and he starts minting coins with a ram's head coming out the top of Alexander's or his forehead. So he's still got the elephant skin tusk, he's still got pelt, he's still got the elephant, and then now he's got some ram's head coming through there to signify the god of Zeus Amun, like a hybrid of Zeus and Amun, Amun being one of the major gods of Egypt. And it's him demonstrating, yes, basically I'm continuing Alexander's tradition, and he's in Egypt where he wanted to be, and I'm continuing that in his stead. I'm the guy who's going to continue the Alexander tradition in that way. And then you've got all these other generals who are minting coins with the elephant skin pelt because everyone wants to tie themselves to Alexander's achievements because he was super famous, obviously. We're still talking about him and there's so much media on him. Everyone wants to know about him and talk about him. These guys are really tying themselves to his achievements and using it as a way to legitimize their rules. At this stage, not as kings, still as just satrapies and working together to keep the empire there until the basically while this joint rule goes, because I forgot about mentioning Alexander's Alexander's son, named Alexander the Fourth, who at this stage is about between, he wasn't born by Alexander's death, but then he was, and then he's 4 or 5 to 7 or so. So he's a young king, can't take rule. So everyone's like just hanging back to see how this joint rule goes with a mentally impaired half brother and a infant son. But that in itself has its own tensions as well, which we can get into in a bit. But yeah, so in terms of stories told, huge. You can have deep dives into these things, and they really tell a lot by when you look at it. You can barely see the horns themselves; they're there. You see them, and you're just like, oh, that means all of this, and it has so many implications to it.
Absolutely. And it is very interesting because again, I'm making comparisons to the Romans again because the Romans use, of course, gold coins to establish their legacy, and you also have the different emperors who appear now and then. Nero, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Octavian, Tiberius, Germanicus, Valens, Constantine the Great, Theodoric. He's a barbarian king or German king who takes over the empire, and so forth. They all want to use coins as a way to legitimize their rule, which I often find very, very fascinating. And also, going back to the successors, that is one aspect I have never learned about, how Ptolemy took Alexander's body, buried him in Egypt, and kind of said, like, I'm honoring our general's last wish. He wanted to be buried in Egypt. And also, it's like the perfect cover story because it's like, who can say otherwise, because Alexander's dead. You can't really say like, oh, that's not what he wants. Like, well, did you know what he wanted? No. And I also think the generals were at a point where it's like, we can't really keep doing this anymore, like warmongering as we've done before, because the empire was so vast. I mean, I'm going to make a comparison, or rather a reference to the first episode in this season, where it's like, what was Alexander's end goal? He already had the largest empire of the time during his day, yet he didn't know how to properly govern it. It's almost like, in a way, the generals were kind of giving, what's the word I'm thinking of? Saying, like, we're going to be better rulers than Alexander ever was. Like, he was a great general. He was a great military commander. But in terms of leading, he didn't do jack that. Like he didn't pay us. So now, as a final insult to him, we're going to rule his kingdoms. We're not going to say we're kings. We're just going to be kings in all but name. So it's kind of like a last bit of like defiance for the emperors. And I'm also now realizing we didn't also talk about the other kingdom, which is a successor kingdom, but not of like the main ones, which are, of course, the Bactrians of
Oh,
the Indo Greco region. So, have you ever come across that in your research when looking about the coins of the success period? And are those kind of on the same lines as like the main ones as opposed to the Ptolemies? Or do the Bactrians take on a whole new different approach, a little more on the hybridization?
I would say straight off the bat, I hadn't come across a lot of Bactrian coinage in itself in my studies so far. That was mainly on the Ptolemaic and Antigonid and early Seleucid
Okay.
representations. But Bactria, I guess, as a rule of thumb, given it's so far east, it's in like modern day Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, I think as well. Maybe it's the farthest reaches of the empire, so remote, and they were having revolts during Alexander's lifetime, and straight after, who was it? Cylon, I think it was.
Right.
Is that the one?
I
The
think so, yes.
sub commander who went out and to quell the rebellion for Perdiccas, who was acting as regent at that point, and ended up, I believe, just taking over himself. Or it was a horrible thing where he murdered a whole bunch of Greek mutineers who wanted to go home or start their own state. We're not 100% sure. And then basically it sort of became its own thing. And so when it comes to, I would definitely say there'd be more hybridization with the coinage and representation there because they're not as adherent to the Macedonian traditions. It's so remote. Apparently, like a lot of the Macedonians didn't want to be there because it was just so remote. They'd been in, the gardens and palaces of Babylon not that long before. They're like, this is great. Everything's green and lush. There's gold everywhere. And then they head up to like the area of Bactria, and it's just so arid and desert-like. And I mean, there was still obviously rich greeneries around, but for them, it was sort of like going to a frontier. You're like, well, you've
Hmm.
just been in a metropolis, and now you're going out to a frontier. I don't know about this. So they weren't too thrilled, or weren't too, what's the word? Weren't too, I'm trying to think of the term. They weren't too worried if it fell away, which eventually it would, and become its own thing. But it still had a Greek or Hellenic influence on that. So, short answer, I don't know much about their coins yet, but I'm hoping to jump more into that.
Okay. And it's fair to make a safe hypothesis that the Bactrians, who probably were the farthest away from the main one, probably did take on a hybridization of like who they were, but more so of their own identity. They're not trying to be like Alexander or follow his traditions because they are so completely isolated. But then you look at like the main ones, the Antiochs, the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies. Those are the big three,
Mm.
and it is very interesting if you go throughout history. And it's almost like a very interesting domino effect. You have the Antiochs who fight the Romans. They're the first ones to get removed. You then have the Seleucids, who are the next ones to fall. And then by 32 BC, the Ptolemies are the last bastion of Alexander's legacy and the coinage. But now I'm wondering at what point did they just get away with like Alexander, honoring Alexander, and said, you know what, we're already ruling as ourselves. In your research, Patrick, when do you see that transition where they're not so much as guardians of Alexander's territories, but the kings and queens of their new realms?
Okay, so I think traditionally, when the kings, it was Antigonus the One-Eyed and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes, the Besieger, as he's called. They
Mm,
famously were declared or hailed kings. I believe it was in 309 BCE when it appears on effications and stuff like that. Um, And it wasn't long after that seemed to be when the floodgates opened, and not long after, I think it
Mm.
was a year after, or 6 months to a year after, Ptolemy was like, "Oh, by the way, I'm a king as well, or pharaoh slash king." And then Cassandra, I think it was as well in Macedonia, and then Lysimachus, I think it was, or Lysimachus in Thrace did it as well, and pretty much everyone's throwing themselves up as kings. But I did a research paper for my capstone unit for my ancient history degree, and it touched on basically the question I posed myself. I'm talking a lot about Ptolemy in this one, but that's that's all right. Was when Ptolemy in his case, when he or did he start considering himself to be ruling as a king before the time he declared it? And I argued that it comes out in the coinage, but also his constant attempts to try to marry into the Antigone, the Argead family through his Alexander's still living sister Cleopatra, I believe it was. But my main argument was through a coin that he produced. I want to say off the top of the bat, it was about 307, so a couple of years before the declaration, where excuse me, he's produced a gold medallion coin, which is kind of like a commemorative coin he would dish out to high-ranking members of the army, and then it would trickle down. So this, really interesting thing about this coin, which is again one of these small changes, but huge in its detail, was on the reverse side. So we'd still have the Alexander with, say, his elephant skin cap and his horns, linking Ptolemy himself to Hellenic and Egyptian rules and foundation myths and all that. But on the reverse side of the coin, he would have a ship, like a really basic ship, which I believe it's called a prover, is the insignia they've got on the back of the coin, which I
Mm.
don't have an image of that, unfortunately. And that was to signify or refer to a famous naval battle that Ptolemy won over the Antigonans, I believe it was. So Antigonus won I, and I think it was he actually fought over Demetrius no, it wasn't Salamis because he lost that one, and it was a famous enough battle where the Ptolemaic army prevailed, and it was really good. So you think, okay, what's the point in that? But what what I argued the point was is that you're now not simply trying to link yourself to the achievements of Alexander. You're now propping up your own achievements. Where in Macedonian society, you're a warrior class still. They still, like, even though they've inherited a lot of wealth, a lot of territory, and everything's changed in terms of their living standards, they still come from a warrior class. These are still the blokes who grew up in Philip II's court, and it was all about manly endeavors. Like, you famously couldn't recline on a couch in at banquets and that until you'd killed a boar, hunted a boar single-handed, or either by a spear or by yourself. And so the masculine and the martial mentality there was still super prevalent. So I argue that when Ptolemy started minting coins with this symbol of the prover, which symbolizes his military victory over a rival, that was him putting himself forward to the rest of to his people, but also the rest of the Hellenic world, that he's a legit dude. He's not just a satrapy, even though he was still saying he was. He's now doing his own thing in his own right. Egypt itself, after Perdiccas had tried and failed to invade, had pretty much held firm. There'd been no foreign armies came ravaging the lands or anything like that. It was pretty much safe. And again, that was something that Ptolemy he would later earn the name, or give himself the name Sotor, or Soter at the end, meaning basically like protector, divine, or along that lines. And his whole push was like, "Yep, we're big in battles. We've got the Prover. Look at that. Remember that victory. I'm linked to Alexander and also to Egypt." And also, I'm a protector. He started replacing Zeus, which was a big back end on reverse coins. A seated Zeus holding an eagle was huge, and with a lot of Near Eastern links to it. But he would start using a shielded Athena, basically signifying
Mm.
protection. So he'd be like, "Guys, I can win a great battle. You've seen that with the prober, and also your lands are looking pretty good in Egypt. I'm going to protect you. The Ptolemaic protection is there, and also I'm being protected by the gods because I'm able to protect you guys. So
Right.
I argued that it was around about that time when he started minting those coins that he believed himself that he was ruling as a king in his own right. No one could really challenge him in Egypt, and it was a couple of years before the official proclamation was made.
Interesting. Because, yeah, that definitely goes back to, what I'm talking about, the, now I'm making a comparison to the Romans, where it's like, when Rome fell, you had the successor kingdoms, you had the Franks, you had the Germans, you had the Kingdom of Italy, and so forth. And you see these change in, the coinage and how, minting the coins, that's also a skill as well to make sure that it looks exactly correct. And you can tell like the change in times. And I think that's the one thing that the Greeks had over the Romans, in the sense that when the successor periods came about, the successors of Alexander, yes, they were not part of his imperial bloodline, but they were still able to adhere to the martial teachings, the disciplines, and make sure that, we are going to be legitimate. Our coins are going to reflect that. They're going to show a high level of quality. Whereas if you look at a Roman coin from the early imperial age and then a Roman coin of the Western Empire, the late 400s, you can tell there's a fall in quality
Oh yeah.
really, really much. Where you don't kind of see that in the successor states of Alexander the Great, which is often uh, very, very intriguing. So now let's actually talk about the other kingdoms as well, because I know the Ptolemies definitely get a lot of recognition, namely also because of Cleopatra. But what about the Seleucids and the Antiochs? Because I feel they don't get a lot of recognition in historical scholarship, except when it comes to the Roman wars that involved in. You'll have the Roman Antioch War or the Roman Seleucid War. That's the only time most people will ever hear of these two kingdoms. So, in your research, what have you uncovered about those other successor kingdoms and how they are different from the Ptolemies, as opposed from the obvious?
Okay, well, I guess what I would argue is that between the Seleucids, between the Antigonids, and even between the Macedonian and Thracian kingdoms, there's not a massive amount of early change, as we were saying with that. Seleucus himself or Seleucus the First and his contemporaries, they basically would be championing the elephant pelt Alexander. That would
Mm,
be, yep, because their main push was like, we've got with their section of the empire, they've got a lot of elephants there, and they
yeah.
can draw from the region of India and like their. Well, Porus wasn't around at that point. He died not that long after Alexander did, but there was quite a famous thing where Seleucus would trade away a large part of the eastern, the eastern parts of his territory for basically a whole bunch of war elephants. So
Mm,
because he was like, I don't want to deal with this area. I'll tell you what, just give me some elephants because they're like the superpower weapon of the ancient world.
yes, the tanks of the ancient world.
Exactly. Give us a whole bunch of them. You can take land from here to wherever you want backwards, and I'll deal with that. So the emphasis of elephants for Seleucus was huge, and that just reflects in his coinage. But he was you tend to see not really up until about the 307s and that, like when Ptolemy's doing his thing, any real changes in that way. There, you do see coins with very similar to the Alexander style, pretty much carbon copy, but it's got Philip Aridaeus printed on it when he was alive under his rules because he was taken by Perdiccas, and then after that he was with Antigonus, I believe, and then he was carted off to Macedonia with Cassander, who was just a crazy dude. Um, So not a lot of change in the early coinage. For them, they were still adhering to that traditions, but then Seleucus himself would stick to the elephant theme because that was his superpower, his chief weapon that he had, and and good ties to the east as well because that helped keep things going for him because it's very
Yes.
eastern part of the empire, kept everyone in tow with that, so he wasn't fully Macedonian with his representation, kind of like Ptolemy with he wasn't fully Macedonian, he still did a lot of Egyptian themes, just like what Seleucus was doing, just to keep everyone chill over that part. Antigonus, I should have done more on Antigonus. I didn't have enough space to be able to do enough of a comparison with my studies, which would have been great because Antigonus the One-Eyed he was the major force for years in that period. And like you said, he's not given enough credit, um, or at least not enough limelight. There's not enough information for him. But I think because he did some things with his coinage, with him and his son Demetrius, which was
Mm.
very just like standard of the time. He was more focused on getting control of the heirs at some point earlier, and then reducing other rivals' ability to marry into Alexander's family. So, and then championing the freedom of the Greeks, which was a classic theme of the Hellenic expansion. Would be we're going to free the Greeks, but also not really free the Greeks. So, what I would say about the coinage in the early production at that stage, it would very much just keep to the norm, and it would almost follow the what would you say, the progression that Ptolemy would lay out. I think because, and I keep going back to Ptolemy, I'm sorry everybody, but I think because he was the most stable state, he was able to dedicate time and resources earlier to making different changes to what he wanted because he's like, mate, I'm secure where I am. I'm not getting invaded anytime soon. Um, I've got the time and the resources to be able to really dedicate the basically the need that making change happen in the coins that I produce. So I wouldn't say they're following him exactly. Oh, Ptolemy did this. Now we better do this. I just think that he kind of started, and then he sort of in a way started that change. Just like how Antigonus and Demetrius, when they proclaimed themselves king, it was like, oh, we can do that now, and so everyone rushed to declare themselves as kings.
Interesting. So it almost seems like literally the Ptolemies are literally the guys who are like the experimenters in the sense of what we can do and what we can do later. Because you're absolutely right. When you look at the history of the Ptolemies, they really don't get invaded a lot. There's not a lot of political unrest that is documented during the period. You know, we see a lot of revolts in Antioch and Seleucids during their respective years, but not so much when it comes to the Ptolemies. And we only learn more about the Ptolemies until the last pharaoh, which is Cleopatra, who marries Caesar and all of that. So it is really
Do
interesting how.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
So you do see at the earliest part, so just after Alexander dies, he goes over and takes over as satrap of Egypt, and there's a lot of unrest going on in the western city region of Cyrene, which that's I cannot wait to do this story in the podcast. I cannot wait. It's so part of it. It's a crazy story. But there's like a semi mini revolt from one of Alexander's like satrapies who Ptolemy was taking over from, and
Mm,
Ptolemy kind of finances. He tries to get involved, but not in a huge way because he's still got one eye on Babylon and what's going on with the other successors and what they're doing. But there is that civil strife. A few tens of thousands of people die. So it's a
well,
big for them. It's a big battle and a big conflict. But there is that sort of immediate thing, and then like you said, it's pretty chill. There might be some issues with the guys down south, further up the Nile, um, but in comparison to the rest of the Hellenic world, they're pretty they're pretty secure. And I'd argue that I think the other successors were doing a lot of experimenting. I think everyone was experimenting on how to traverse this new world, this new reality that they were in, without having such a charismatic, just super powered personality that was Alexander, and such his ability to keep all these separate peoples in check in terms of his generals, have them all work towards one common goal. Having him taken away, and you could see a lot of experimentation from people like Eumenes the Greek he's a great example of how he would experiment with ways that he could use the Alexander memory and the image to keep himself going. Like, he was a guy who, as a Greek, he was not allowed to inherit the Macedonian throne for obvious reasons, being an outsider to them. He would use his way. He became a really good general. He was a bookkeeper, I believe it was, and for Alexander, and he became a really, really good general, really savvy dude. And he would basically champion himself as saying, "Hey guys, I am Greek, so therefore I can't inherit the throne. Therefore, I'm going to do what I can to, like, I'm not a threat. I'm not a threat to you guys to take over the throne because I can't have it." And nobody trusted him because he was a Greek, I mean, supposedly, according to the writings, but he had enough followers and all that. He was really successful in campaigns and all that. And he ended up, just in terms of what I'm saying about experimentation, to keep a whole bunch of generals that were really distrustful of him and just generally not like look down on him because he was a Greek and they were Macedonian. He would create a tent that had a lot of Alexander's signia there. I think they had his purple robe, he had his scepter and all that, and basically would set up I think it was a golden throne, I might be wrong, like basically a throne for the absent Alexander. They set up all the stuff on this empty throne, and he would conduct his war meetings and that like Alexander's there, and all the generals around him were like, "Yeah, this is pretty cool. We like this because it reminds us of Alexander." And so, which is bizarre. You're like, okay, we're going to take orders seemingly from a dead guy, or we're going to have discussions with this guy or act like we're doing it around him. But that seemed to placate these generals, and that just an example of way aside of the coins. That doesn't even show up in the coins for obvious reasons. It'd be pretty wacky, but just the sense that I definitely would say that every single one of these successors were experimenting in various ways to keep themselves alive, keep themselves in rule, and eventually legitimize their rule so they can go out on their own right. There's a point with I want to say it's Lysimachus in Thrace. He ends up minting coins very similar in iconography to what Ptolemy was doing with the elephant skin pelt and the Zeus horns. But also, I think with that one, he also introduced a mitra, which is like a little thing at the front of his head, and that was to link him with Dionysus as well. So it was, in a way, you could say Lysimachus was like, "All right, I almost acknowledge that Alexander is under Ptolemy's protection, influence, whatever you have it, because his body's still in Egypt. He's not going anywhere anytime soon." He's almost like accepting the fact that that's the reality, but then also having the mitra there to link him with Dionysus has that good strong tie with Olympias, who was obviously a great follower of Dionysus, and linked him to that side of the royal family or that side of Alexander's heritage. So it was, yeah, really interesting to see that kind of those sorts of experimentations, and sometimes it worked out, other times it didn't, often to a lot of bloodshed and carnage and despair. But it was really through marriage, through coinage, through imagery, iconography, through random worships of empty thrones, people were trying their best to survive and thrive in this new reality. Yeah,
Absolutely. And from what it sounds like, as we kind of wrap up this discussion, it seems like, when you look at the coinage and kind to like this idea of like, legitimacy, it seems the Ptolemies were probably, you could argue, the most successful in terms of like, blending the two cultures together, whereas the Seleucids and the Antiochs, they did hybridize a little bit, but that was more so of like, after then they wanted to like not claim legitimacy, but keep to the traditions of Alexander the Great. Whereas Ptolemy was realizing, I'm in a position where I can establish my own kingdom, but how do I go about it the most subtle way without making it very obvious? And I love how, you talked about, the coins, especially during the Ptolemaic reign, where he has this blend of like a moon and Zeus, this blend of the two, that Alexander is a representative of the Greek pantheon, but he's now also an inheritor of the Egyptian pantheon, which is ultimately very fascinating. And it's probably something, the same idea that the Romans would carry when it comes to their coinage as well, that the emperors were seen as divine figures, maybe not to the same extent of, Alexander, who believed himself a descendant of Heracles, but it is ultimately very fascinating. And there's a whole bunch of different avenues to explore of the successor periods and Alexander the Great's reign. So, as a final discussion, Patrick, in your opinion, do you believe that this scholarship, the scholarship of coinage, minting, and its historiography in the realm of history, is overlooked and often ignored in the field?
I wouldn't say it's ignored, and I also say from the top of the bat, like I'm in no way a numismatic professional. I am super enamored by it, and I want to learn more. So if people want to send me coins for me to study, absolutely, I'll take all comers. I would say I wouldn't say it's overlooked. I think the fact that it is constantly referred to by historians, like modern day historians, as a way to link these things. The fact that we're talking about it, even
Mm-hmm.
from like your examples through the Roman period, and all that. I think the fact that if you look at a coin today, Australian, any sort of Western coin, especially, you can see the exact same templates with certain changes to what they were doing in Alexander's time. The side profile face, that I believe, I may be wrong, I don't know super much about Chinese and
Right.
further eastern, but that was the first time a living monarch was put on a
Mm.
coin. And this is unheard of, especially for them, because they would always be, especially in the Greek world, they'd be putting on images of the gods and goddesses, and then a image of an animal, like a dolphin or something like that, depending on your region.
Right.
So having the head of a monarch, a living monarch at that, was a massive change. And so the fact that that in itself, from that period, is still something that we see in coinage today is huge. It's subtle but huge. It's the fact that we're like, okay, it's obviously a really good tool for how rulers, institutions would basically advertise themselves as rulers or the ruling body. And I wouldn't say it's overlooked because it is often mentioned and all that, and they're super interesting to look into. It would be nice to see, I guess, more of a study, and I'd love to do some more linking of the old stories, especially with the like Antigonids and Seleucids and the kingdoms that came from there, because it's very interesting. Because what we said about, or what you touched on with divination and stuff like that, and people proclaiming themselves gods, it wasn't too long after this period until people like Antigonus One-Eye, Demetrius Poliorcetes, Ptolemy, even Seleucus were hailed as gods.
Mm-hmm.
And often they were hailed as gods by I think Antigonus and Demetrius had statues made of them and were proclaimed by gods as gods in Rhodes. I think it was after they did something cool there, or in Athens or something like that. But then it would establish the practice of the next monarch would proclaim the dead monarch as being a god, and that's something that we see from the early Roman imperial period going upwards and stuff like that. So I definitely would say it's not overlooked, but it would be it'd be interesting to see more for sure.
Awesome. And with that, viewers and listeners, we conclude another great episode of the Historians on series, as well as end the month of February on a banger. And I want to give a huge thank you to everyone who has been a part of the month of February, and a huge thank you to my good friend Patrick for coming back on the show, making his second appearance in the lineup. And honestly, it's a pleasure to have him back on the show again. Now, before we officially end, Patrick, I know you have a lot of things coming up uh, this year. Are there any special announcements you'd like to make? Any new episodes being released? Any projects coming up we should be looking out for? and where can people find you on social media to reach out to you, as well as listen to your podcast?
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Again, just to start, thank you so much for having me on, Gabriel. It's a pleasure chatting to you as always, and yeah, hope to continue more. And hopefully, I didn't get too many things wrong with my chats and all that. But it has been an absolute pleasure. I love talking history, and I love talking history with you, and it's been a ton of fun. In terms of what's coming up, recently released the episode on part one of Windows. So if you like a really super interesting, bonkers, yet really in some like a lot of very similar themes to other myth tales that we know of. Check it out. I'll be dropping the episode part 2 and 3 of those in due course. The article I've written on the Second World War, a little known campaign outside of the Pacific region called the Kokoda Trail campaign in Papua New Guinea. So the large island to the north of Australia, super important strategically for safety of the Australian mainland from a Japanese air raids, and they believe might have been an invasion, but I'm not so sure. I think it was just something they had in the war rooms to maybe do. I don't think they're actually capable of mounting a successful land invasion. That would be a lot. But anyway, well, that would be what would I say? Threatening the movement of resources between the US and Australian / British forces in there. So super important for that, and occurred at the same time as the Guadalcanal campaign. Famous US Marines, horrible place to be, same as Kokoda. And I talk about basically the what it was like, what it would have been like to fight a war in that region, which I argue is one of the worst places to fight a war. And so that'll be out in the I think it's the month of May, March. I think it is. I think it's a spring edition. I think Courtney told me. Anyway, with it's No Point Publishing, that'll be on the In Command. Is the name of the online military history journal. It's a great one. You've written for it yourself. And thank you for getting me in touch with Courtney, the editor for that one. That was awesome.
Absolutely.
So that'll be coming out. There's another one coming for him, which I actually will be writing on the early successor period and expand on kind of what we talked about, a little bit on the coins, but more about the wacky ways in which these rulers try to legitimize their rules and basically stay alive. So that'll be coming up in the coming months. I want to say there will be some more bonus episodes. For those who haven't listened to my podcast, we do a set narrative on stories, which is very organic, a lot of shit talking and stuff like that. Sorry about the language. And we do a lot of bonus episodes where we do film reviews, a couple of rewatches, and looking to get into a bit more, just sort of like we do here, a lot more of a more relaxed chat about things that we like, or about history, or the media's representation of history. So there'll probably be a few more of those, and then I don't want to give a time date because working full time and 2 young kids, it's taken my time from me as much more than I thought it would. But I definitely plan to have season 3 follow the successor period and basically tie in with an episode I did on Philip II of Macedon, on his assassination, link that with Alexander the Great's life. And strangely enough, not do a whole season on Alexander. I just want to have him as a linking thing because I find Philip and the successor period more interesting now than Alexander, which I sort of flipped that as a kid. I used to think Alexander was the bee's knees as a kid, which is super interesting, does all the things you need to as a young kid who's interested in history. But I find both periods on either side, much more interesting and so just dense with information and stories and that. So I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that and having that out for the people. For those that want to see, we're on all major podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Acast, Rcast, anything with a cast on it, really. Just look up A Little History podcast. So A Little, obviously my last name's Little, so play on words there. Look up A Little History podcast, and you can't miss us. We're the red fire-bricked looking Greek pottery themes on that one with the imagery. And we're also on Facebook and Twitter and even TikTok, doing some silly reenactments on that as under A Little History podcast. So yeah, check it out. We'd love to get you guys on board and let us know how we're going.
Awesome. I will linking all of those down below in the description of this video, as well as tagging Patrick's first interview here on the show. Now, for those remember, it is a two-parter, so I'll be tagging both videos right up here for you to watch, part 1 and part 2. So make sure to check those out, as well as listen to Patrick's podcast, which again, I'll provide the link down below. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for a successful month of 2025, February. And again, a huge thank you to Patrick for capping off this month. I really do appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, again, for your love and support. And make sure to follow me on all social medias, LinkedIn, Instagram, as well as other formats. And as always, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below. And as always, this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world.
Alrighty.
All right, and then stop